Women Surrealists and the Antler Queen. Sabina Stent is a freelance writer specializing in women surrealists and visual culture. She's interested in how feminist surrealists explore bodies, fashion, the cinematic, and the uncanny. Her chapter, Women Surrealists and the Egyptian Imagination, appears in Tea with the Sphinx, Ancient Egypt and the Modern Imagination. So over to you, Sabina.
Okay, thank you. So obviously I'm coming from this from a little bit of a different perspective than all of you, because I'm coming from an art history perspective, which I think has some overlaps. And I think some of the papers, some of the really amazing papers we've already seen this morning touches on some of the things I'll be exploring as well. So I've tried to keep this as contained as possible to save me going, because as you all know, you start researching and talking about something and then you can just keep going. So we'll see how this goes. Okay, so there's a moment in the penultimate episode of Yellowjackets season 1 when we finally see Lottie don the headdress and claim the crown of the Antler Queen. While this much anticipated reveal confirmed one of the show's more popular fan theories, the sequence, which took place during the fantastically trippy mushroom scene, amalgamated many elements of what makes Yellowjackets so appealing and exciting to viewers, especially feral young women, the unexplained and unpredictable, the potential cannibalism we've been teased since the very first episode, feminine wildness, and animalism. Throughout the show, and especially now considering the shocking end of season cliffhanger, I have been fascinated by Lottie. From her psychic experiences as a child, her spiritual rebirth, to what I call, well, or her baptism, I should say, and to what I call her descent into the darkness when Lorelei died, and taking on the mantle of the Antler Queen, Lottie has stepped into her power as Yellowjackets has progressed. More specifically, I have been struck by Lottie's similarities, whether artistically, personally, and even sartorially, to horned female deities as captured by women surrealists, including Leonora Carrington, Remedios Varo, and Leonore Feeney. What these artists, as well as Yellowjackets, did so well was revert the art movement's patriarchal symbol of the Minotaur and its dominating emblem of masculine superiority and female suppression by transforming it into one of innate female power, magic, and transformation. So in this paper, I will briefly explore Lottie's connection to the Antler Queen alongside women surrealist artists. Looking to the show, as well as art and the uncanny, I hope to show how Lottie, a young woman with a keen sense of intuition, who can see things outside the boundaries of what we can call our world or the logical world, shares similar characteristics to some of the most significant women in modern art. Sartorially, I also wish to consider how Lottie's horns became her armor, something that has reflected in the well-known fashion magic of Leonore Feeney. So I'm going to begin by showing you a couple of examples by some very well-known male artists in order to demonstrate how women shifted the narrative away from submissive female bodies violated by men to autonomous and powerful horned female deities and entities. So there is a well-known Picasso painting titled Minotaur Ravishing a Female Centaur. And you can see that. So the MoMA website describes the painting as so. The mythical Minotaur, part man, part bull, was Picasso's alter ego in the 1930s and part of a broader exploration of classicism that persisted in his work for many years. The Minotaur was also emblematic for surrealists who saw it as a personification of forbidden desires. For Picasso, it expressed complex emotions at a time of personal turmoil. The Minotaur symbolized lasciviousness, violence, guilt, and despair. Appearing frequently throughout a range of surrealist works, the horned dominating beast retained and reinforced the misogyny that ran throughout the movement. The group's literature journal, which ran from 1930 to 1939, was even named Minotaur, and in 1934 featured images of Hans Bellmer's notorious sexually explicit dolls. I haven't included the dolls here, but if anyone wants to Google them, you're very welcome to. They are, once seen, you won't forget them. In 1945, Man Ray painted his partner, Juliet Browner, who the couple would marry actually in Los Angeles the following year, in the repose of the Minotaur in his Vine Street studio in Hollywood. Browner can be seen on the couch, her arms bent to the side, one leg bent. And this is something like, if you see other paintings that are named Minotaur by men, the Minotaur seems to be in this position. So in my mind's eye, I'm thinking, she is the Minotaur in this one. I think this photograph is interesting because I think she's not being dominated by the Minotaur. I think she herself is the Minotaur, but I like to think of her that way. As more women became active in the Surrealist movement, they actively explored and reimagined subjects and situations usually dominated by men. So again, it's women reclaiming male-dominated spaces. In 1959, the Spanish-Mexican Surrealist artist Remedios Varo painted Minotaur, a cosmically blue, feminine horned creature. Known for her androgynous alien figures with oval faces and almond-shaped eyes, who more than resembled the artist herself, Varo's appeasing yet magically inhabited protagonists always disarm any preconceived threat or strangeness because of who or what they resemble. In Minotaur, the figure encourages her spectators or guests towards her by way of a friendly greeting. And you see this a lot in Varo's art, that her creatures, they always look so pleasant. You never feel like there's any threat. It doesn't matter what they are, if they're from another world, if they're an alien, if they're, like a magical apparition. They just have this pleasant disposition about them. Varo's Minotaur is both human and not human, thin-legged, delicate, divine. She's dressed in form-fitting cross-stitch. She is surrounded by the hood of a shimmering cloak, and significantly, small white horns curve upward from each side of her head. So if you can see just about, there's some like tiny little horns, which she hasn't got those like massive, quite bull horns yet. Varo has painted a tiny galaxy inside a crown of hair. So you can just about see in the center, there's like a little moon. There's a great paper titled Horns of the Goddess, the Minotaur in the works of Varo, Carrington and Lamb, which I found it on an e-library online, and I couldn't find the name of the author, and it's really annoying me. So I will try and find the name of the author, because obviously I like to credit the author. And the author states, the author describes the work as a cosmos in which gossamer clouds of blue-white material float upward, anchored by a small glowing orb in the center. And so that's the end of the quote. And we can also see a gold key if we look in the right hand of the Minotaur, a gold key in her elegant hands. And the author goes on to say, though ordinarily seen as a symbol of the masculine, this bull's horns are moon-shaped, a symbolic link to the possibility that the bull can also be a lunar symbol when ridden by a moon goddess. In the context, the bull usually has the meaning of the taming of the masculine and animal nature. So the mention of a horned bull allows me to spin off into a brief aside about the Italian-Argentine artist Leonor Fini. Oops, sorry. I love Leonor Fini. She's so much fun to work on. Fashion, when we talk about Leonor Fini, we think of her fashion. Self-governed, and she always used to attend balls and have these fantastically elaborate outfits and headdresses. Self-governed, powerful women who only answered to the cat god, much like the artist herself, are the crux of Fini's work, and never more so than in her personal sartorial style, where she inhabits the role of what I call a fashion magic sorceress. And these two paintings, I'm not sure whether the painting came first or the costume came first and the painting. So I've never been able to find that out. Fini had a great amount of pleasure in costume and dress, and every year would spend late summers at a monastery in Nonza, Corsica, to coincide with her birthday. Friends would arrive, and photographers, including Eddie Buffario, would document the occasion. In the words of her biographer, Peter Webb, some of the most beautiful and inspired photographs ever taken of Leonor as muse and sorceress were taken by Buffario. And Leonore knew the power of dress. She knew like dress as armor. We can also draw on the fashion magic of the late great Lee Alexander McQueen, as horns, armor, and furs transformed women into powerful warriors. And that was always the thing about McQueen's fashion. He always wanted to say his fashion, he wanted women to be powerful. He wanted, like, his whole fashion was about making women warriors, through costume. And I just think that's such a brilliant and fascinating subject. And it's always such a pleasure to explore how, people write off. Sometimes people look at fashion things as being not having much weight, but there's such power in fashion, and in fashion as armor. So Feeney knew very well the how costume, how dress, how wearing something could become your armor. And in taking on the role of the Antler Queen and popping on the crown, Lottie harnesses this energy, this armor, and this power. So back to the artworks themselves. So while I can see flashes of Lottie in the general history of surrealism, that's very very vague, and in Remedios Vara's art, and in how Leonore Feeney channeled fashion magic, the artist, I think, is very significant when discussing Lottie, both personally and in her association to the Antler Queen, is Leonora Carrington. Now, I think some of you may be familiar with Leonora Carrington, the British-Mexican surrealist. She's finally gaining new fans, greater artistic acclaim and recognition with every passing day. And she's just such a wonderfully fascinating, brilliant artist. One of surrealism's most enduring works is Carrington's 1953 painting, And Then We Saw the Daughter of the Minotaur, a work where a white Minotaur appears to be holding court at a ceremonial table. Two children can be seen standing in line. A humanoid flower is to her left, and a sprite-like wisp, as if appearing from another realm, dances into the frame, as if from an apparition doorway, a portal's opened up. Tendrils weave up columns, clouds are in the sky, and two white hyenas, one resting, one standing, are in the corner of her work. And hyenas were a recurring theme in Carrington's work. Carrington's art is magical, otherworldly, and alchemical. To quote Siobhan Leddy on the Gallery Wendy Norris page, bodies transform into birds or beasts, ghostly figures float midair. As viewers, we are more than just witnesses to this magic. We become complicit in it. So Leddy continues, we are offered a seat at the ceremonial table, alongside dogs, creatures, a minotaur, and a fantastical, almost aquatic-looking creature. In the 1953 work, And Then We Saw the Daughter of the Minotaur, mysterious glass orbs pull at the tablecloth as though guided by a force of their own. At the right of the painting, something not quite human dances towards us. No wonder Edward James, Carrington's friend and patron, once described her work as brewed rather than painted. And I love this description of her paintings as brewed rather than through magical ceremony. And Carrington was very good at magical domesticity, and that's another element of her work. While Picasso's depiction of the Minotaur was pure male gaze and voyeuristic dominating fantasy, in And Then We Saw the Daughter of the Minotaur, Carrington reworks the mythological narrative. Returning to that paper I mentioned earlier, the author states it is clear that Carrington is reshaping the mythological narrative in which the archetypal feminine, represented by the Minotaur's mother, Queen Pasiphae, and Ariadne, the Princess of Crete, is powerless in the face of masculine forces that are blindly caught in the need to gain power over an adversary, end quote. So Carrington's Minotaur is all-governing, she's all-powerful, ceremonial and magical. Hardly passive, she is in control. Known for weaving surrealism and magical realms, the tarot and myth, Carrington's otherworldly visions dated back to childhood when she was visited by apparitions in the form of various animals, cats, wild tortoises, or even a horse. For Carrington, the white horse became a symbol of freedom. When Lottie approached Lorelei, that she's seeing things about her, referring to her visions, Lorelei says, Lorelei says, I was taught that visions are God's way of communicating. They could either be a warning or a revelation. And Lottie replies, how do they know they're not just crazy? Lorelei answers, they're evidence of unseen things. They knew it because they believed it. And obviously there's power in believing what you see. Madness. Lottie referred to herself being crazy, and the theme of madness ripples throughout Surrealism. In André Breton, the self-styled pope of Surrealism's seminal novel Naja, he describes an encounter with a mysterious woman on the streets of Paris. He describes this young woman as mentally unstable or mad. As he writes in the book, I have taken Naja from the first day to the last for a free genius. Something like one of those spirits in the air which certain magical practices momentarily permit us to entertain, but which we can never overcome. As she herself says, I am the soul in limbo. Okay, I'm going to cut out a bit because I'm running out of time. So Lottie's ability to see the hidden increases along with her power over the course of the series. And this appears to become stronger as season 1 concludes. Lottie is the one who says, follow the stag in Coach Ben's direction during the shroom scene. And she is the one who we could say castrates the male Minotaur by taking on the role of the Antler Queen. Oops, sorry. And this is the moment we witness Lottie fully in control of her power and command. And this is not the first time Lottie saw the stag. While underwater during Lorelei's baptism, she says she thinks she's seen the light. And this could also be Lottie going down below. In 1940, Carrington painted Down Below, and in 1943 wrote the book of the same name, both about her psychiatric breakdown and horrendous time in a mental facility. In the latter, Carrington writes, I was transforming my blood into comprehensive energy, masculine and feminine, microcosmic and the macrocosmic, and into a wine that was drunk by the moon and the sun. We can compare and relate Carrington's breakdown in Down Below to Lottie's trajectory throughout the series. The blood energy Carrington speaks of, the fusion of power traditionally associated with specific genders, and the alchemical power of the body links beautifully to the shot of Lottie in the season 1 finale, when she places a bloodied heart into a hollow tree trunk and says the incantation, Verse laissons mes beaux amis, and let the darkness set us free. Carrington would harness his trauma and horror into her later work, especially ideas of the alchemical body. And I can't wait to see what they do next with that. And here's one of Carrington's later works, again, a horned creature. So in conclusion, I hope I have demonstrated in my mind's eye how Lottie and Yellowjackets' Antler Queen can be connected to both women surrealists and their horned deities, specifically how women artists turned this masculine symbol into innate female power. Light doesn't exist without darkness, and those labeled mad women are often the most perceptive and the most open to mythic and otherworldly messages. Sometimes there is power when accepting the darkness within. To finish on this fantastic quote by Leonore Feeney, she said, I know that I'm related to the idea of Lilith, the anti-Eve, and that my universe is that of spirit. It's me, but it's not just me. It is the essence of the feminine. She is the woman, symbol of beauty and deep knowledge. She emerges from the water, the essential element of life, the primeval material, because she knows how to survive the cataclysm. And that's everything. And I'm sorry if I rushed towards the end. Thank you.
Oh, that was fantastic, Sabina. Thank you. A really fascinating and beautiful presentation. So our next speaker is John Savarese, who is going to be speaking on or presenting a paper entitled It Didn't Want Him to Leave, Folk Horror, Folk Psychology, and the New Animism. John is an associate professor of English at the University of Waterloo and the author of Romanticism's Other Minds, Poetry, Cognition, and the Science of Sociability. He is currently at work on a new project about the relation of mind and environment in Gothic literature and media. Okay, are you ready, John?
Yeah, is the connection working here?
It is, yes, perfect.
Great. Okay, thanks. So my talk's about really about the way that Yellowjackets work. It's somewhere at the intersection between folk horror and eco horror. And my focus really is on the kind of the occult nature spirit aspect of the series, the power in the woods that structures the supernatural aspect of the plot, and which, as the season concludes, Lottie offers the heart of a bear, and which Thaisa years later seems still to be making offerings. So there's a lot of seance magic or spirit conjuring suggested, but the show's primary commitment is to its wilderness setting, a return to or reinvention of ancient practices, obviously ritual cannibalism, but also hunting, foraging, negotiating with or appeasing some spirit of the woods. And like much folk horror, the show's supernatural interests are geared very much toward reviving a world of ancient, primitive, or pre-Christian rituals, specifically with the connection between communities and the land, the environment. And many of the key touchstones of folk horror are oriented toward agrarian traditions, agrarian communities with the harvest festival or the fiend in the furrows. And this pushes back a bit deeper here. I worked mainly on 18th century Gothic and Romanticism. So for me, what's interesting about the sorts of texts that we're now tending to call folk horror is that they maintain an interest in residual culturally mediated or culturally scaffolded sort of supernatural beliefs and practices. Those ways that the Gothic mode encourages thinking about the history of religion, the long history of beliefs and practices that predate modernity, that go into hiding but remain uncannily present as a repressed of modernity. And in that regard, it is that I think that Yellowjackets goes a bit further, treading some of the same ground as Enlightenment and Romantic accounts of the origins of religious thinking, of supernatural beliefs and practices that writers of the 18th century, from the rhetorician Robert Louth to poets like James Macpherson and William Blake, imagined emerging out of early humanity's basic cognitive capacities and social arrangements. So in a word, what I'm looking at here is animistic thinking, the kind of relation to a local environment that attributed mental presences to natural objects, or according to Enlightenment moral psychology, that tended to over-attribute mental states to non-mental entities. So that's what I'm focusing on in this talk. And as the title suggests, quoting Lottie's eerie remark about the vines that they find wrapped around the wheels of a plane, it didn't want him to leave. I'm going to be thinking about plants, what it means to attribute intentions to plant life, to talk about plants as wanting things or as expressing intentions, as readable in terms of a mentalistic system. What the show is thinking through is what I'm asking when it comes to these castaways staking out a new form of relation with each other and with their local environment. So before I turn to that scene from episode 4, I'll just really briefly look at a little bit of background, the history of ideas that this show, and I think folk horror more broadly, is drawing on. And that's the account of superstition or so-called primitive animism that lies behind an Enlightenment account of the history of religion and that became the founding template for Gothic supernaturalism. One of the best-known statements of this idea, that the ancient human mind was prone to anthropomorphize its environment, to look at nature and see minds at work, comes from William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he offers a theory of animistic vision. Quote, "The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods and geniuses, calling them by names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. It was only with the rise of institutional religion and of priesthood that people forgot, quote, that all deities reside in the human breast." But the roots of this idea come from Enlightenment philology, poetics, biblical studies. So the Hebrew scholar Robert Louth wrote that poetic language itself was a vestige of the mind's early confused state. For him, poetic ways of speaking arise from an early overwhelmed and agitated mind, is his word. He writes, "To those who are violently agitated themselves, the universal nature of things seems under a necessity of being affected with similar emotions." So for him, it was that the early mind is not developed enough yet to sort out its own feelings from things that might be happening in the surrounding environment. Meanwhile, for Johann Gottfried Herder in Germany, Hebrew scriptural poetry, quote, "places man in a world full of animation where every flower, every tree, every star rejoices with us, has its own spirit, and feels its own principles of life." So there's this longstanding tradition in the very intellectual history that births the Gothic mode that made animism the mark of a kind of earlier foundational mode of relating to objects and environments prior to the disenchantment that came with modernity and Enlightenment. And that nostalgia for tradition, organic communities, an enchanted or a not yet disenchanted way of seeing the world is one of the clearest lines you can draw between a certain strain of romanticism and more recent folk horror. And I guess the touchstone there, you only need to think of the role of Robert Burns in similar songs in Wicker Man. But in Yellowjackets, there's an even further gesture toward the type of narrative that would imagine that foundational moment, a group of people who need to reinvent society for themselves, and out of that set of interactions and survival practices winds up discovering or inventing religion again, as if for the first time. I should say right away that I think the show's not naively invested in that kind of nostalgic narrative. I think it's also well, it's true that folk horror strikes a difficult kind of devil's bargain between a nostalgia for the past and demonizing the past as barbaric. But I actually think Yellowjackets is very self-aware of that and is thinking through the problematic as it goes, that it replays this kind of origin of religion story, but also subjects some of the ways we tend to think about that to serious scrutiny. For starters, it seems interested in alternative accounts and different types of accounts of an animistic approach to ecology. Recent developments in cognitive anthropology of religion have suggested that animism, as it has typically been framed, has been misshaped to some extent by Western conceptions of nature and of humanity. As a matter of fact, Western academic conceptions of animism right through to recent decades have typically viewed animistic thinking basically in the same way as the 18th century writers I just quoted, as populating the landscape with human-like agencies. As anthropologists Bethanu Ojuleto-Mays, Rebecca Seligman, and Douglas Medin have called this concept of animism recently anthropocentric animism, that which defines the mentalizing that it sees as human-like, being very like a human mind. From their own fieldwork, they propose an alternate framework that better characterizes some, but not all, animistic orientations, which they term ecocentric animism. An ecocentric animism grants non-human entities like plants a simpler and more direct form of agency, often based not on human-like desires, but on rational inferences about things like sunlight that a plant might actually want and have ways of getting, the kinds of things, the kinds of signals that non-human entities exchange with humans. This lines up to some degree with the biological field of study known as biosemiotics, studies of signaling and signification at the pre-linguistic level. Now, normally attributions of mental states to anything, to another person, to detecting or suspecting that something might be intentionally coordinated, lines up with the domain of reasoning that psychology, that cognitive psychologists tend to call folk psychology, a set of principles that we may or may not be accurate, but that most people use in order to make sense of behavior, to make judgments about who or what is an agent, and to make inferences about those agents on the basis of their behavior. It's kind of long-standing pre-scientific account that most people seem to have and use, and that's why it's called a folk psychology. It's sort of a commonly held, spontaneously arising set of beliefs that tends to lead people to understand behavior in the same way. From the point of view of a stance toward the environment, these anthropologists have suggested that instead of thinking about a folk psychology on account of minds, we might do better to think of full communication, a sense of intentionality, need, desire, signaling that does not require a theory of full-fledged mindedness or personhood to be attributed to these natural objects. The question of what plants want might be a very practical, sensible inference, not the projection of a hidden spiritual agent. Now, at this point, I would like to turn to the show itself and see how it's negotiating these different frameworks. The scene I'm focusing on is episode 4. The girls are out foraging. They're relying in large part on Girl Scout knowledge, right, of which plants and mushrooms are edible and which are poisonous. And the scene sets this against a more common kind of distance or ignorance of food sources that usually governs people's lives. Laura Lee asks, are any of these like maple syrup trees? Misty's impatient. Could you just show us something that's actually edible so we can get going? Thaisa tries to collate what they're learning to make it usable. Okay, so everyone just focus. We know we can't touch those and those ones. No mushrooms, no mushrooms. It's right at this point that Jackie calls their attention to an abandoned plane, and the scene accelerates with an attempt to start it. The plane almost runs straight into Van. Jackie pushes her out of the way. The propeller stops inches from her face because the plane's wheels have been wrapped up in the tangled vines that have curled around its axles. Lottie's statement ends the scene ominously, "It didn't want him to leave." So it's interesting to me that there's this really explicit juxtaposition of foraging, a taxonomy of the particular powers of plants and fungi, with the attribution of an intention to the vines, or at least an intention of some non-specific it at this point, enacted through the vegetation. Vines do seem to show a greater degree of agency than some plants. It's a little bit more common for people to think maybe of vines wanting to curl around things, tendrils grasping and climbing in ways that often seem strategic, if only for the pursuit of sunlight, to reach the top of a tree canopy, for example. Lottie's implication is that the vines or the woods or it wanted to prevent the previous inhabitant of the cabin from leaving, that it trapped him here, and the vines entangled the wheels in order to make that happen. But if we step back a bit, the idea that the vines are doing something intentional is first suggested, and I think first suggested to the viewer, in that very fast-paced moment, when it is also a pretty remarkable narrative coincidence, one that strains credulity, perhaps. The fact that the wheels are being held is what saved Jackie from being shredded by the plane's propeller. And this is a narratively important moment. It's as if they reached out and grabbed the plane to save her, but it's immediately, as Jackie is in the process of saving Van by pushing her out of the way, that the vines are doubling the kind of action that Jackie had been doing for Van. And that's a narratively loaded act of saving a friend, I guess is the question, right? In Jackie's case, we're asked to read that human action pretty deeply in terms of character psychology and character development. It's a making of amends for an earlier moment in the immediate wreckage of their own plane crash when Jackie was willing to leave Van behind. So that act of repayment or of making amends is pretty high stakes in terms of how the narrative is asking us to map out the relations among characters and who thinks what about whom. To then be asked immediately to think of the vines as saving Jackie in a similar way is a pretty remarkable thing. And it's interesting that actually, now that I think about it, that Lottie bypasses that level of explanation. She's not thinking about the vines wanting to save Jackie. She's thinking about the longer term set of motives and strategies where what it wanted was to keep the previous tenant from leaving. Really, I'm just interested in the juxtaposition there, what it says about the kinds of acts of attribution that the show's asking for. It might be worth pointing out that this is the same episode that has a very pointed comment on displacing intentions, on intentions that seem to bleed into the scene and leave the person who actually holds them. This is the flashback into the death of Nat's father, where the season's foreshadowing, its kind of suggestion that she had killed him turns out a bit differently. She meant to shoot him, pulled the trigger, but had left the safety on. Then he trips and accidentally shoots himself. So there's a displacement or an externalization of that intentional action too in the same episode. Something that was intended, was attempted, and then happened anyway, but only because of sheer coincidence, only because the situation conspired to make it so. I guess I'm arguing that this is at least the logic of this episode, if not of the show's broader relation to eco-horror and to the kind of distributed agency that we see in a haunted world. All right, so concluding thoughts. In his essay, Notes on the Possibility of a Canadian Folk Horror, the author James Granger suggests that any Canadian set folk horror would need to treat the relation to primitive tradition very carefully. Where a European folk horror tends to explore a dominant culture's own pre-modern past, North American folk horror will quickly need to face up to a colonial past. Turning to what I've here called an ecocentric animism would easily become a co-opting of indigenous culture or a demonizing of them in the name of the horror in folk horror. Or, and this is something that almost happens in Yellowjackets, but then doesn't, effacing the colonial past altogether to suggest a pure wilderness, much like those pristine Canadian Rockies seem to be at first. By my argument, Yellowjackets takes up this challenge directly by foregrounding this tension between the lure of a new animism birthed in the Canadian Rockies, as if a return to an older way of seeing, as if a return to origins, and the darker logic of a more anthropocentric animism, a way of seeing malevolent presences that do think and plan like people. At times, this seems to be an actual anthropomorphic demonic presence. Alternately, seems to be one already conditioned by the colonial past, specifically the Francophone Canadian past, or by a Christianized modernity, Lottie's baptism moment as a transference of an evangelical Christianity into this new wilderness where it takes a different and darker form. And of course, there's also what I think is one of the show's main liabilities for viewers watching with an eye toward disability representation. It's building on a common association of the schizophrenia spectrum with the over-attribution or misattribution of intentionality. This is something that the showrunners have incidentally said they're going to think hard about going forward, and it's also one reason I'm looking forward to Nicole Hamilton's talk later today. So in the end, it seems like what we're being given is a huge number of possible frameworks to try to explain how intentions are being attributed to natural and supernatural agencies. I'm going to end with a confession that I don't quite know yet how all this comes together, partly because it still feels in many ways very early in the story. But what I'm coming to conclude, at least so far with season 1, is that this series is really doing a lot of work with these longstanding Gothic motifs about a deep religious past, its sources of fascination and horror and revivalism, with a layered approach to ideas about how minds or spirits or agencies inhere in objects and in the interactions between communities and their environment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. That was a really, really interesting paper and some absolutely fascinating thoughts there. So thank you for that. And we'll come back to some of those ideas, I'm sure, in the questions. Oh, yeah. And we already have a question. Excellent. Okay, that's good. So a question for John and Sabina. The pagan elements which feed really frequently into folk horror are really clear in Yellowjackets, but there's a lot of Christian iconography and weaving into the storyline. How does this complicate or synergize with the pagan folk horror elements? And that's a great question from Vicky.
Oh, I haven't really thought about that, actually. That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, there is, isn't there? I think, I don't know if I want to say it's still a little bit early to say, because obviously it's one season in, we've been fed so much information at this point. But yeah, I haven't really thought about that, in all honesty. Yeah, I'm curious what John thinks. Do you have any?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that it really does seem like it's a kind of hybrid phenomenon we're seeing. That it is definitely we saw a little bit of coaching from Laura Lee, right? We see a little bit of how to think about processing visions, for example, right? It was one thing that was mentioned, and we've also got this French colonial wilderness trailblazing kind of background there too. I just, that's where I guess it would just seem to me like what we're seeing here is something that it's not ancient, it's not traditional, it's actually something that's produced as a kind of, I guess what I come to think of it in terms of sort of the invented tradition, something that's posited as if it's coming out of time immemorial, but is actually something that's being pieced together in the present.
I think it's sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's especially where these characters are, they're searching for faith that they will be rescued, and I think it's just how everyone has, like, obviously Lorelei is turning more to the Christian side of it, and then obviously we have more the pagan folk horror elements of it. So I think they all have their own faith in different ways, and I think it's just accepting each other's kind of belief systems and taking that on, and then interlinking them together so that they kind of, one feeds off the other. Because obviously with Lottie, she went to Lorelei and was asking her about God and things, but then obviously Lottie's done some things that kind of contradict that. So I think it's just, I think that there's a lot of, like, I'm not a religious scholar, so, but I think there's like a lot of faith in how these characters come. They all have like their own faith that they will be found. So I think it's just a matter of their taking things from where they can in order to keep going, really. But I'm not sure that's one of my ideas surrounding it.
Not at all. Those are both really interesting responses. We have another question in the chat, and it's from Vincent, who says he can ask himself. So if you want to go on and do that.
Hello, am I coming through? Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks for stunning papers. Originally, I was writing this question for Barbara, but as I was hearing Kate's paper, I thought actually it links quite nicely to yours as well. And I'd like to ask about the racial politics of Tass's feral identity, because she seems to, we learn, here's, going back to earlier paper, the mystery box, what's going on around them. It turns out she's got the sort of fugue state and she's doing things that she's not aware of. And when she does so, she seems to go into this kind of animalistic identity. Now, I wonder, does this animalistic, savage aspect to her perpetuate racial stereotypes of animalistic and savage behavior? Or could this be a further highlighting, as a couple of papers, as your papers have talked about, the contradictions of expected and acceptable feminine identity? Because Tai is an intersectional figure. She's female, she's Black, she's homosexual, and she's mentally ill. And she seeks this public acceptance as an elected official. And her electoral win could be seen as an acceptance of intersectionality. Or is there a sort of strange form of racial abuse, piling as many struggles as possible on the person of color who still triumphs? So I guess that's sort of like 2.5 questions. But yeah, I'd love to know what you both think of that.
Okay, I'll go first. Although I have to say the short answer is, to be honest, I don't know yet. I don't know, because that was, to be honest, also why I included at the end these still open research questions, because I noticed that that is a big question. Yeah, what to make of the other Gothic double, yeah, and of the differences between the two Gothic doubles. And I think there are definitely, as you pointed out, differences, because I mean, I think that there are some of these, yeah, feral tendencies also within Shauna and her Gothic double, but they're nowhere near as strong and as pronounced as is in the case of Tai. Yeah, I think I also have to say I have not looked that closely at Tai yet, but I think with Tai, it would be my sort of argument about the connection to the wilderness as a masculine space and control about the wilderness would be very difficult to apply to Tai, because she seems, yeah, we're very sort of the kind of element of control there. I mean, I think it's also a much more strongly pronounced Gothic double. Yeah, I mean, there is even relative early on that her son says the bad one. Yeah, calls basically her other, like the bad one was it, or something like that. So it's even in the dialogue, this doubling. I mean, I can further say that I also thought about that with the whiteness, that it's kind of difficult to imagine having Tai basically in the role of Shauna. So this contributes to basically Shauna's story being a very white one, and with suburbia being a very white space. Of course, it would be possible, yeah, but it would sort of like invite a very different reading. And how Tai, yeah, that there is this element of her also, which is different, because Shauna, I mean, she has this family, but to some extent she has failed, because there is also this aspect that nowadays just being a suburban housewife, yeah, just being that is not really all that normative. And that is sort of something sometimes also indicated in the dialogue, that she's also not happy with that. And she could have been more, she got into brown. And Tai has, of course, succeeded to some extent, yeah, which Shauna hasn't, which maybe also kind of relates to this, her double being much more extreme, yeah, because what she is, what she stands for, yeah, is much more successful. To be honest, about how, I mean, to be honest, I've had this thought not upon first viewing, but after engaging sort of with my topic, whether there isn't some racial stereotyping, yeah, about virality, yeah, and primitivity going on there. But to be honest, I would be very reluctant to say something conclusive about that.
Fair.
That's great. Kate, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know the question was addressed to Kate as well.
I don't have that much to add, but I do want to say that, to be honest, I guess I wasn't that surprised that they had her as the character that sort of fell into that strange fugue state, where I didn't get to this in my talk, but like eating dirt as her coping mechanism for hunger, which is actually a real syndrome. But I think at minimum, she is this type A character. So they are generally the ones to kind of crack under the pressure as well. So I think there's definitely something there though to her being, like you mentioned, Vincent, this black gay figure that has these mental health issues but has still succeeded, which is wildly successful in comparison, like you mentioned, to someone like Shauna on paper. But yeah, I haven't looked into that too much. I was a little strapped for time, but it's a great question, Vincent, and I'm going to think about it now in next season.
Just a very quick related point, the idea of seeing women eating dirt as this coping mechanism. There's a similar aspect in the series The Great, which is it makes an interesting comparison. So I just thought of that connection.
Yeah, that's when she's pregnant, right? It's part of those. Yeah, that is like I said, real syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
We have another question for Kate, and this one comes from Leanne. And the question is, what do you think about the moments that blend the two timelines together? For example, when Shauna stabs Adam and we see her younger self, and what that means for how we understand their adolescent progression or stasis?
No, that is a great question, which is part of why I had my little addendum at the end of my talk, that I think it's really important to remember that this idea of moving from girlhood to adulthood is not really a thing. It's kind of, you can't really pick a moment in time. People don't sort of shed that identity. And I think this is so obvious here. She has also this immense trauma, I suppose. So Shauna, has these flashbacks very much like people, I imagine, who have similar trauma and similar she's clearly still very traumatized. I guess she's never dealt with it. They mentioned that they never had therapy. They agreed to not talk about it. So I think in some ways she probably is still in the woods. She'll always still be in the woods.
That's a really good response. We have a follow-up question for Barbara from Lindsay. And Lindsay writes, I feel like the Christian iconography associated with the established patriarchal order, which is being challenged and overtaken by a new matriarchal order linked to pre-Christian religion, the ancient gods of the dirt and the sky. And Lindsay wants to know how Barbara feels about this in relation to her ideas of the wilderness and masculinity. Does Christianity relate to these things? So masculinity and whiteness, whereas maybe paganism might be more closely linked to femininity, for example.
I think in these notions of the American wilderness as a masculine space and these constructs of masculinity associated with that, first of all, I think those are also sometimes not that clear cut. That there are maybe kind of also contradictory aspects to that. Part of that is also the whole frontier myth. Which of course.
Sorry, 2 seconds there. I think there's a little bit of noise in the background.
Really?
So if someone could, it's not. I don't think it's coming from you, but I think if everyone could just make sure they have their microphones off. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. That there is part of this American wilderness as masculine space is the frontier. Yeah, and the frontiersman. And of course, that there is an implied association with Christianity with that. But I think at the same time that a lot of these constructs also kind of are interested in some sort of primitive masculinity, of howling with the wolves. And this primitive masculinity then to some extent also fits with social constructs about primitive masculinity being violent and controlling. These ideas sort of fit. So I don't think that there is necessarily a full-on contradiction with this sort of like matriarchal primitivity, sort of maybe like which YELLOWJACKETS is sort of like alluding to or going in that direction. Yeah, it is sort of it is sort of maybe the primitive matriarchy versus the primitive patriarchy of the wilderness. But again, as I've said, the whiteness aspect is something I would also need to look in further I think, associated with the Christianity aspect.
Thank you. That's a great response. Okay, I think we're kind of coming up towards the end of the panel time. And thanks again to our wonderful presenters for their excellent papers. I loved chairing this panel. It was great. So thank you all so much.